Bonjour tout le monde. Bonjour Olivier. On va attendre quelques minutes avant de lancer le FLM. We're just going to wait a few minutes. Olivier is going to appear, I guess.
Hello.
Bonjour Olivier.
Sorry, I was struggling to turn on my mic. Hello, Imelda. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Fine. We're looking forward to kickstart the session. Sorry, just sorting a few technical problems. Okay.
I'm just waiting just like 2-3 minutes because people are just joining the seminar. So.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Shall we start?
Can we just wait like 1-2 minutes?
Okay.
Just people are getting connected.
Let me close my window.
Imelda, it's better if you keep your window because we are getting it registered. And so Olivier is going to shut his screen after. And because as it is recorded, it will be on our site. So if you don't mind to keep your screen on. Great. So you might start, Olivier.
Okay. Well, good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us for this new Friday lunch meeting for the climate organized by the Climate Economics Chair. Today, we are extremely glad to welcome Imelda in this session because Imelda was I met Imelda during a competition organized under the auspices of the US Association for Energy Economics, and Imelda presented a very interesting paper at this session. Also, I realized that it could be extremely useful for us to welcome Imelda to see some fresh research being conducted on electricity markets. So Imelda is now an assistant professor in the Department of International Economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Before that, she used to be a postdoctoral researcher at the Carlos III University in Madrid, and she worked there with Natalia Fabra. It was, if I remember correctly, it was on an ERC funded project, right?
Yes.
And Imelda has already published extensively in the Journal of Development Economics or in the American Economic, the Journal of the American Economic Association. Papers and proceeding, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure that there are many interesting things to come. So given the interesting collaboration that you have built with Natalia. So Imelda, the floor is yours for this paper. So thank you so much for having accepted to give this seminar.
Okay, thanks for having me. So it's my pleasure to present this joint work with Natalia Fabra, in which we work while I was there, and it's about how price exposures to firms impact market power, and we're going to learn lessons from the changes in renewable regulations in Spain. So I think most of you already know that the shares of renewables in global electricity generations has been growing significantly, 29% in 2020. So to fully decarbonize the power sectors, regulators continuously have to choose among alternatives what is the best to support existing renewable plans and therefore encourage more investment in the future. So one of the key debate in the electricity sector is how do we pay those renewables and what are the implications on the market outcomes. So two most popular payment scheme for renewables are paying them based on fixed price, so-called feed-in tariff, or at market-based prices, so-called feed-in premia. And I'm going to highlight some of the key important characteristics. Under fixed prices or feed-in tariff, so prices are set ex ante by the regulators or through auctions. Because some of the firm's output from the renewables are already set based on fixed price, this implies that the firm's ability to increase price is less. However, as the prices are fixed, there will be no gain doing arbitrage across market as prices are the same. I'm going to talk more about this arbitrage. And while under variable prices, firms are paid based on their output based on market prices on the top of fixed premia. And while it does not have a direct impact on market power as what happened in the fixed prices case, it encourages arbitrage. Why firms want to engage in arbitrage? Because they believe they will gain by buying at the cheaper market and resell it at the more expensive market. So arbitrage help push the prices down, the difference between the price in the day ahead, price in the spot market, and therefore indirectly reduce market power. Later, I'm going to talk more about this arbitrage, but here I just want to point out the key distinctions of these two pricing schemes, which are our primary focus. So essentially, these papers aim to analyze how the degree of renewable price exposures affect the performance of the electricity market once the investment have taken place. So to answer that questions, we think that Iberian electricity market provide an ideal laboratory because it's experienced two exogenous changes in the way winds are paid. So in 2013, before 2013, renewables, wind especially, are paid based on variable price. And then suddenly, since February 2013, regulators changed it to pay these wind producers based on fixed prices. And later on in April 2014, they switch it back to pay them based on variable prices. So there's these three different pricing schemes or regimes in which we label it as R1, R2, and R3. Various reasons potentially can explain why these regulatory changes happened. Prior to 2013, market prices were relatively higher compared to the fixed prices. Hence, the regulators probably thought that by moving wind producers to the fixed price, their payment will be reduced. And then the opposite occurred prior to the 2014 regulatory change. And a little bit about the market rules. So electricity markets are commonly organized as a sequence of markets. So with the large markets that operates one day ahead of the actual delivery, and then small markets, sequential markets that operate closer to the real time, usually called intraday or spot market. Generators typically exert market power by withholding part of their productions in the day ahead market, increasing its prices, and then selling the leftover amount at the lower price in the subsequent market. So the fact that prices in the day ahead is always higher than prices in the intraday market is consistent with the dominant firm exercising market power by withholding their output in the day ahead market. So access to very detailed wholesale market bid data in this Iberian electricity market, covering periods where the regulatory changes taking place, allow us to conduct empirical analysis of this causal effect of changes in the degree of renewable price exposure on firms' bidding behavior and the resulting impact on market power. So here we are talking about a quarter of the demand is fulfilled from the wind plants, and therefore changes in the regulations on paying wind plant are going to be meaningful. And as I mentioned earlier, price in day ahead is consistently always higher relative to price in intraday, consistent with the fact that dominant firms exercise market power by withholding outputs. Also important to point out that dominant wind share, it means the dominant own the majority of the wind plants. These are going to be important to keep in mind when we discuss the channels later. So existing studies has pointed out some advantage and disadvantage of paying renewables based on fixed prices. So it has been shown that sealing firms from risk encourage entry of the small players to the market. And while some of them argue that paying them based on fixed price will not allow the value of an investment to be internalized. And while this paper contributions is different from above because we take into account the existing investment, and we highlight how fixed prices can mitigate market power in the day ahead, while showing how it discourages arbitrage. So really our key contributions here is showing this trade-off of impact on market prices on efficiency from these fixed prices relative to the variable prices. So we really compare these two. And also our key message of the paper is really understanding the impact of renewable policies requires an analysis of the interactions between conventional and renewables suppliers, and not just the renewables alone. So here we wanted to show some sort of stylized fact by showing the raw data of how the bidding behavior across these three different price regimes. So as mentioned earlier, in regime 1, regulators pay them based on market prices or feed-in premia, similar to regime 3, while in regime 2, firms, wind producers specifically, receive fixed prices. And here what we see is the difference between how much they sold in the day ahead and the final output they ended up producing. So the difference here, positive, means that the fringe, which is a set of small firms, they offer sell. If positive meaning they offer sell, while negative means they're undersell in the day ahead. So here, what striking we can see very clearly during the fixed price regimes, fringe firms stop offer selling here. Even both dominance and fringe stop offer selling here, because really there's no gains in doing any offer selling, because the prices between the day ahead and the intraday or the spot markets is the same. They will receive the same price based on their wind output. So here, I think the key message in these plots, in really simple stylus fact, is that the pricing regimes, price exposures to firms matters in the way firms are bidding. So therefore, we proceed with a more careful empirical analysis from now on. So to repeat and really specifically mentions our research questions here is that under which pricing schemes is day-ahead market power lower, and what are the channels? So we will ended up testing 3 hypotheses. With the first one, testing the relevance of this forward contract effect, in which I explain it later on. Essentially, given the demand under fixed prices or feed-in tariff, we will see more competitive bidding. So it means that lower lower incentive to exercise market power under fixed prices. While in the second one, we're going to test the relevance of the arbitrage effects, in which this arbitrage effect will only occur while firms is paid based on market price or feed-in premium and not under fixed price. So we're going to show these 2 effects are relevant, but ultimately we want to know which of these 2 channels dominate and leading to less market power in the day ahead. So we're going to test these 3, and to summarize the results briefly, what we see is that under variable price or feed-in premium, wind firms arbitrage the price differences. So we see fully exposing renewables to electricity market prices, encourage them to arbitrage the resulting price differences across sequential market, in which reduces dominant firms' incentive to exercise market power in the day ahead. So this what we refer to as arbitrage effect. While under fixed prices, shielding renewable producers from short-run electricity market essentially bars them from serving as arbitrageurs, as they receive the same price regardless whether they sell their output in the day ahead or in the subsequent markets. However, even if this limit arbitrage, it mitigates market power through more direct channels, because fixed prices reduce the dominant producer's ability to increase market prices, as part of their output has already been set based on the fixed price. So we refer these to forward contract effects. While the arbitrage and forward contract effect act in the opposite directions, we show that their relative strengths depends on the market structure. Therefore, I mentioned earlier about the ownership of the wind plants. So in particular, the higher the shares of the wind outputs in the hands of the dominant producers, the stronger the forward contract effects and the weaker the arbitrage effects. Hence, shielding the renewables producers from market prices is relatively more effective for mitigating market power in a highly concentrated market. So which is what we see here in the context of Iberian electricity market. So these are the roadmap that I'm going to talk about this, discuss about these 3 hypotheses that we test through our empirical analysis. And hopefully if we have some more time, I'm going to discuss very briefly on this simple model to illustrate what was going on and provide some intuitions why we expect the result that we see in the empirical analysis, and then conclude. So the first forward contract effect. Really our focus here is whether the strategic firms take into account changes their wind outputs when setting prices. So if dominant firms do not take into account the wind output under fixed prices, then it points out to sort of so-called forward contract effects that we label it. So we test whether markups are lower under fixed prices relative to variable prices. We test markups whether it's lower under fixed prices relatively to variable prices, which pointed out that for contract effect exists. So this is a theoretical profit maximizations equations, which is a problem for monopolies or dominant firms. This is well known and straightforward. Essentially, there are two markets, right? Subscript 1 is a day ahead market, and subscript 2 is the intraday market or the spot market. And so in the profit maximizations will be done by solving the backward induction. So in the second market, if the monopolies has zero marginal cost, they will simply equate the marginal revenue in the second market to its marginal cost. However, in the, yeah. Is there any sound? Okay, I will continue. And in the first market, in which in the day ahead, which we highlight here, in the first market, the price in the second market becomes the opportunity cost for the first market, because the firms know that they can sell their output in the second market. Therefore, the P2 price in the second market becomes the shadow marginal cost for the price market plus some markup components. So this is a structural equations in the sense that this is the slope of the residual demand, and this is the output they ended up selling. So Q, the output, and then I is the essentially the dummy for whether they're in the regimes of fixed price, and it equal to 0 if they're in the regimes of market prices or feed-in premia. So essentially this is going to be 0. So the terms here disappears under feed-in premia. And we are translated into the structural equations into econometrics equations. We are going to use the marginal bids. So really the prices around the market clearing prices, and then some predicted forecasted P2 and slopes of the residual demands as the denominators and the quantity sold. And the interesting part and the primary focus here is these coefficients in which the slopes is interacted with the dummy of the pricing regime. And we're going to show these coefficients only. And then surely there are some identification challenges in which we're going to use two-stage least squares. There's some endogeneities in the market components because it's clearly endogenous. So we are instrumenting this slope of the residual demand using wind speed and precipitations, which is commonly used in literature. While we control for sets of, we include a set of variable flexible controls to avoid this omitted variable bias. And therefore we report only the coefficients that interacted with the dummy of the pricing regime. So here essentially we see that under regime 2, prices are lower relative to others, right? So this is consistent saying that under fixed regime, fixed prices regimes, prices are lower relative to regime variable prices regimes, in which it's consistent with the fact that they're for contract effects is relevant in this case. Firms are not internalizing their win output when they're faced based on fixed price, because they cannot they have less incentive to exercise market power because part of their output is already paid based on fixed prices. This is what we see. And I mean, firms are vertically integrated in the setting, in this setting. So if we include vertically integrated plans, firms, we still see similar conclusions on the relevance of the forward contract effects. So we conclude the relevance of the forward contract effects, and then we move on to arbitrage effects. So here, essentially, we want to see whether firms fringe, which is a set of smaller wind producers, engage in arbitrage. It means that they sell, they offer sell in the day ahead or not. So then how do we measure? So the next question is, how do we measure offer sell by these fringe firms? So they will only offer sales if there are non-zero coefficients, statistically non-zero coefficients for the predicted price premium. So this is measures the sort of strategic behaviors of these fringe firms, because there are many other reasons why firms engage in arbitrage. It could be because of the demands or wind forecast errors and others. So therefore, we're going to capture the strategic reasons on this arbitrage if it links to the changes in the predicted price premium. So how do we do this? There are a lot of thing changes as well during these regulatory regimes in this true period 2012 to 2015. How do we account for that? So we're going to use difference and differences approach, in which we need other control groups in which are not affected by the changes in regulatory. So we have options for the control groups, in which independent retailers, they always arbitrage, they always arbitrage, but they are not affected by the regulatory changes. And we also have other renewables, such as solar, hydro, pumped hydro, in which they are not, they also do, they are not affected by these changes in regulatory changes. So we're going to use them as a control groups, but we're going to confirm whether they behave similarly or not. So this is the equations in which we tested whether they behave similarly or not. And to easily see this, whether they behave similar or not, or whether they are appropriate counterfactuals in the absence of regulatory changes, I'm going to show these just these coefficients in the graph, easier to see. So here, the wind is in the blue lines. So positive, it means they do engage in arbitrage. Positive, zero means they are not. And the black lines is the retailers. So retailers, they are on average always engage in arbitrage in all the three pricing regimes, because they are not affected by the regulatory changes. While wind, R1 is there under variable price, in which they have incentive to do arbitrage, and R2 is under fixed price, in which they are not have incentive to do arbitrage, in which we see it is as zero. And then in R3, they back to doing arbitrage. So essentially, the difference between the retailers and the wind during this period, it becomes our measures of the relevance of the arbitrage. And similar conclusions seems to happen in the when we use non-wind renewables. Non-wind renewables, they never do arbitrage. So they always behave as there's no arbitrage. So they behave similarly under fixed prices. And therefore, when we use non-wind renewables as the control groups, how do we measure the relevance of the arbitrage effects is by computing the difference between the other renewables and wind during the variable prices. So again, other renewables are always paid based on the fixed price. So they have no incentive to do arbitrage no matter what. So these two plots is just to say that other renewables and retailers are potentially appropriate counterfactuals in the absence of the regulatory changes. And really how to measure it is as follows. So we split the regulatory changes into two samples. The first one where they move from variable price to fixed price, and sample 2 is when they move to fixed price to variable price. And then we analyze each one by one sample by samples. So again, what we're interested is their interaction of wind and the difference in the PT, which is the price differences between day ahead and the intraday. So beta 1 indicates if they are statistically different from 0, it shows the existence of the arbitrage effects. So yeah, as mentioned earlier, I only reported the coefficients for the interactions between the price differences and the dummy of the wind and the pricing regimes. So essentially we see the coefficients if we use non-wind renewables as the control group, or we use retailers as the control groups, it points out very similar coefficients, essentially showing that they stop doing arbitrage when they face fixed prices. However, in regime 3, where they face back to variable price, they back to doing arbitrage. So this show the relevance of the arbitrage effects. Lastly, in order to understand which of these two effects dominate in shaping market power, we leverage our structural estimates early on that I showed to compute the markups. Note that we are using marginal bids, which is the prices surrounding the market clearing price. So any startup cost, the fact that we don't include startup cost wouldn't be much of an issue here. And to simplify it, we show this density, which is markup distributions during 3 pricing regimes. The black one being the markups, the density of the markups during fixed price regimes, while the others is for variable price regimes, in which we see that markups is lower during the price fixed regimes, and therefore we conclude that in the context of Iberian electricity market, we see that markups are lower under pricing under fixed price regimes, and this is consistent with many ways of us splitting the sample depending on amount of wind and the firms, types of firms, essentially similarly giving similar conclusions. Under fixed price regimes in the context of urban electricity market, market powers are lower. So I'm going to illustrate it in the simple model of what the results that we find. Before I started, maybe if there's any questions, is welcome. Okay. So let's illustrate what happens in a very simple, very simple model. So we are in the sequential market in which relevant to the setting of the electricity market that they had labeled as a T-1, spot market is T. The total demand is in the functions of PT, which is consists of the demand that they had and the remaining leftover unserved demand in the spot market. And consumers are myopic in the sense that about 80% of the demand is fulfilled in the day ahead market. And here we illustrate with having two technologies, firms having two technologies. The conventional technologies, the marginal cost equal to C, so it's a non-zero marginal cost, while the wind is zero marginal cost, with the availability is always less or equal to their nameplate capacity. And the firm's ownerships, we have a set of fringe firms in which we labeled as subscript F, in which they are price takers, and then we have dominant firms, dominant firm with subscript D, which own both a technology, conventionals and wind, while the fringe only own wind. So just think of market demand being linear, being traded in the two market, day ahead and spot market. So suppose that in the day ahead market, firms already set their price equal to PT-1. So once the day ahead market closes, firms has incentive to lower the prices in the spot market to allow they're clear for any remaining unserved demand. So optimal pricing for monopolies is well known. If the monopolies has zero marginal cost, they will simply equate the marginal revenue in the spot market equal to the marginal cost. And the price in the second market becomes the opportunity cost in the first market, because the firms know that they can sell their output in the second market. So therefore, P2 becomes the shadow marginal cost for the first market. So the firms will set P1, PT-1, in such that marginal revenue in the day ahead is equal to price at the spot market. These give rise to price discriminations in which price in the day ahead and the spot market is always different, given being the price in the day ahead is always higher than the price in the spot market, in which I mentioned earlier, consistent with the dominant firm exercise market power. This is the baseline case. So what happened if we allow for arbitrage in which the case under feed-in premia? So suppose that the fringe firms engage in arbitrage, so much so that the price between day ahead and the spot market converge, and therefore we ended up with the price subscript M, stands for market, in which what we see here is that price in the day ahead is lower compared to the baseline, while price in the second market, in the spot market, is higher than the baseline. So here what we see is a price going down, they had price going up in the second market, and therefore welfare is lower. Why? Because welfare depends on the P2 price at the spot market, because how much we pay depends on the P2. So welfare will depends on the the price and the spot market, because price in the spot market increase and therefore welfare decrease. And about the consumer surplus, it's ambiguous in this case. And the last case in where we allow for these market power mitigations to occur, which is the ones in the feed-in tariff. Here, what happened is that since the sum of part of the outputs, which the renewables output is already paid based on fixed price, and therefore the market shares of these monopolies is going to be lower. The ability to exercise market power will be reduced by the amount of output that already been paid by the fixed price, and therefore the price in the day ahead will be lower relative to the baseline, because the ability to access market power is lower, as I mentioned earlier. And this will carry forward to the price in the spot market. So they will set the price in the spot market even lower relative to the price in the spot market at the baseline. And therefore, what we see here in the theoretical analysis is that prices in day ahead under feed-in tariffs is going to be lower compared to the baseline, and price in the spot market are going to be lower as well. Since price in the second market, spot market is lower, and therefore it's clear that welfare increase under these pricing regimes, and it's also clear that the consumer surplus will increase, because prices in the second market is what determines how much consumers will pay, and the fact that it's lower than the baseline, it's unambiguously show that the consumer surplus should increase. This is what I mentioned earlier. Yeah, to summarize it, really the key results is that under feed-in premium, prices they had is lower, similar to the feed-in tariff. However, in the spot market, prices in feed-in premium is increased. Prices in spot market under feed-in premium is increased, while under feed-in tariffs is lower. And therefore, total welfare under feed-in tariffs should be higher. However, consumer surplus is going to depend on the magnitude of that. So in feed-in premium, the channel is the arbitrage effects. The arbitrage effects, it works through the shares of wind owned by the small firms, because arbitrage effects works with the fact that these small firms doing arbitrage, while the feed-in tariff works under the shares of the wind outputs owned by the dominant firms. So the fact that we see under feed-in tariff, the market power is the market power is lower, the markup is lower under feed-in tariff. Why? Because in our setting in the Iberian electricity market, it's indeed we see that the shares of the wind output is higher on the hands of renewable at the hands of the dominant firms, and therefore forward contract effect it is dominant under our setting. And therefore, what we observe, what we see in the empirical analysis. And therefore, let's conclude. So to repeat myself, the price exposures encourage fringe producers to be active market participant, and these arbitrage mitigate market power because through their active participations, to active participation of the wind fringe producers. While this reducing price exposures lowers the fringe incentive to arbitrage, but it mitigates market power directly through the dominant players by reducing their amount of output in the day ahead market and the ability to access market power in the day ahead. So really this trade-off, what we see is that depends on the market structures, who owns the renewable energy. So yeah, we believe that these results could be potentially relevant for other markets that also in the setting of it sequentially, emission markets, and so forth. Also probably useful for designing renewables auctions. That's it. Any question?
Many thanks, Imelda, for this brilliant presentation. Is there so many questions from the audience? Otherwise, I have a few. First of all, I would like to apologize for my poor knowledge about the market structure prevailing in Spain. But I'm wondering, well, in your the first part of your presentation, when you were discussing the forward contract effects, I'm wondering if dispatch, matters. I mean, you estimate a linear equation, if I'm correct. Let me see. Yeah, you have this. You have a linear equation that somehow presumes that somehow the profit maximization is invariant over time, more or less. And I'm wondering, well, if the market structure changes over time, it could affect maybe the how can I say, the pricing and the pricing behavior. And I have in mind, for example, if you have nonlinearities created by dispatch issues, if depending on the ownerships of the assets being dispatched, you may have different market shares for the dominant players, and thus a different ability to exercise market power over time. I'm wondering if it's something that is occurring or not in Spain, because you have a homogeneous set of plants being controlled by the dominant players. I would like maybe a few comments on that, if possible. Is it something that you have considered, or is it something that is little affects your estimates?
If I understand it correctly, you're asking if the capacity matters in the forward contract effect.
Yeah, maybe I will. Sorry, I will reformulate my question. We all know that depending, on the demand, we will have a dispatch that will end up by selecting different assets being selected or not to produce or not to produce. And of course, the ownership structure of all of these assets is not homogeneous. So I guess that depending on the dispatch, depending on the specific dispatch occurring at a given time period T or in a given day, you may end up having a different market shares and just a different ability to observe market power being exerted. I'm wondering if it affects or not the profit maximization and thus the markups that could be exerted by the dominant players.
Okay. I would say potentially it would not affect that as much, because the fact that we choose the bids. So we are using the bids is really the bids around the market clearing price. So if there's somehow there's some changes in the dispatch, okay, it should.
So you somehow presume that it doesn't affect the dispatch somehow, right? So it's a marginal effect that you are assuming. Somehow that doesn't have an impact on the dispatch, right? Okay, and I see it. But then you may wonder, well, if you continue when you have an estimate of the density, so the market power being exerted a few slides after this one, again, then you may end up in that case for when you have the densities. I'm wondering that as the densities are computed for various time frames under which the penetration of wind and renewable energy sources is markedly different. I mean, over time, it has increased, the share of RES has increased substantially in Spain. I'm wondering again if, if the market, when you compute a markup, usually you expect to have the standard result, say, stipulating that the markup, the Lerner index, is related to the inverse elasticity of demand and also to the market shares. And so I'm wondering if, again, the distribution of generation assets and across the technologies affect and could modify somehow the results and the distributions that has been occurring, and whether it's, comparing distributions per se is allowed or not, given the changes that have occurred in the market structures.
Right, the wind over time may increase, but during our sample period, the installed capacity of the wind, in which we show in the summary statistics, seems to be very static.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, so that doesn't change much. Sorry for that. I thought that it was much.
No, I should have mentioned this.
Okay.
Yes, but thanks for pointing out.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there so many questions from the audience? At least in the room, nobody is asking. Maybe in online. Okay, so no. Okay, so thank you. Sorry, I think that this closes the session then. So, but thank you again for this paper. Is the paper available now? Do you already make it circulate this paper? Or?
I think I should send it to someone in the email.
Okay.
But it's also available in my website.
Okay, thanks.
So the end versions, the last versions, which is December, at the end of 2021. So yeah, pretty new.
Great. Thank you so much, Imelda, for this bright presentation. Wish you all the very best for the dissemination of this research.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.